What's up, everybody? Welcome to Podcast Now Back to the Past. I'm Alex, and in this video, I wanted to look back at the Home Alone games, primarily Home Alone 1, but this was in that era where there's like 500 different versions of the same thing, right? In fact, on this channel, we've really only covered one such game in depth, and that was actually Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So you got to go back to 1991 for this one, and we got to talk about several versions of the game. Now, for the research purposes of this video that I'm recording, I did actually find you can play the PC version of this game relatively easily. There's several places online that kind of just has the game readily available, and you click it and you start playing it. So I did play through just a little of the PC, and then I would watch videos and Wikipedia and all the other research places for the other locations. But before I get too far into each individual one of these things for Home Alone, let me just say a controversial personal opinion, which is I don't really think this movie was meant to, have a game be based on. And I know that's such a hot take. Look, I don't think these games are very good. My memory of these games is actually only comes from one individual, and that's the Angry Video Game Nerd. I remember, and I guess because I went back down to the, through the rabbit hole, back in the day, oh my God, 10 plus years ago, he had reviewed the second Home Alone game. And I remember that. I mean, I was a big nerd fan growing up, and I actually have gone back to watch several of his videos the past couple months just because it's so legendary. But I remember the Macaulay Culkin episode as well, where he did the first Home Alone. That was actually only like 5-6 years ago. So I rewatched that one just again for kind of educational purposes, see what they thought of it. Now he's very down on the game, and I mean, look, I don't think this game is like the worst thing ever created. And actually, I do think based off the research, some of the games they do a pretty okay job. Like I said, Home Alone #1 is a legendary, movie. We actually just rewatched Home Alone 1 and Home Alone 2. They're great films, a perfect kind of Christmas. I don't know how a situation like that could happen, 2 times in a row, but they're amazing films. Can you make, let's say, a game from that? Well, you can only really focus on one aspect of it, right? And it's the Wet Bandits. And I think that's where these games kind of fall apart a little bit, is you're limited very, very much to one specific instance. Watching the movie or, rewatching it back, there's a lot of setup, and, it's legendary, the entire, taking them out and, torturing them on the verge of, like, murdering these people, right? And it's a longer, part of the movie. It's maybe 10, 15 minutes of it towards the tail end, right? But, like, it's not the whole thing. So when you make a Home Alone game, and maybe this is why we can't have Christmas games. On Friday's video on this channel, we're going to talk about that, Christmas games in general. And there's just not a lot, especially when you look at, like, we actually did this for horror games, and, Nightmare on Elm Street actually did do an attempt at a game, and it didn't work very well. There's a couple of them, but when it comes to movies, Christmas movies turned into games, there's, like, Polar Express, there's Grinch, there's this, but there's actually very, very few, and then there's even less with horror and Halloween. There are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of horror games. There's very, very few Christmas ones, and I think specifically the adaptation, right, using the IP and making a game, I think there's a very simple reason why. A lot of these movies, there's no premise to make a game. I can never imagine an Elf, Will Ferrell, I can never imagine that as a video game. I mean, maybe you could twist it around enough, but, again, you take Home Alone, and you say, well, how can you make that a game? There's really only one, instance of it, and it's fighting the Wet Bandits. And now you could say, can you make an entire game out of that? Well, they certainly tried. So what we have is a multiple versions of this game. Now, again, I played the PC version. Now, from my knowledge here and from the research, the PC version actually seems to be probably top 2 in terms of, like, solidness. Like, it's pretty okay, and it's got the most, I guess, in line with the movie, elements. So this is literally, hey, you get a time limit. These 2 are going to break into your door, and you're going to, have to take them out. And I will say, watching some videos, some people actually had pointed out, one thing that you just can't get over is the top bar that tells you that, they're coming, takes up like half the freaking screen. So I don't know what they were doing there, but the rest of it, I mean, it's fine, right? I think where this game kind of loses itself in other versions is the collectathon kind of idea of, you got to collect the valuables around the house, and you find like a TV and like a random like bookcase, and like the McAllister household is like the richest household on planet Earth, right? Because you were finding gems and jewels and all this stuff, dropping it down. There's like bulletproof, cases and all this stuff. And it's like, why did they choose something like that? And again, I think you just cycle back to, it's not meant for that, right? So unless you are literally setting traps for the bandits in any of these versions, if you're not doing that, the rest of it just becomes like, well, what are you supposed to do? So some of these versions, you fight bosses, you fight a literal ghost, you fight a spider. That's a little bit more in line with the movie, although not really, right? But like fighting a ghost, that's definitely taking some liberties with it, right? The Game Boy version is probably the most dumbed down version of all of it. You're still doing the collectathon, but it's obviously without color, and it's, again, the most bare bones of the entire thing. The Sega Genesis one, besides the PC one, is definitely one that jumps out to me the most, not because of like having to go to defend like all these different households, which, by the way, is again kind of odd, but actually the crafting element of it is pretty darn cool. So even though it's odd to kind of whatever you're doing on your little sled or whatever it is outside, going from place to place. I don't know why Kevin has to be the defender, which, by the way, let me throw this in. None of the Kevins in any of these versions actually look like him. They actually scare me, some of them, in terms of, you see the picture, you see the box cover of the game. None of the actual game versions actually look like that. Sometimes the bandits actually do look like Joe Pesci in them, but for the most part, Kevin doesn't match. But going back to the Sega Genesis, I think the crafting of the materials or the weapons, getting the materials when you're out, in the area, and then crafting them, the animations of taking them out is maybe the coolest thing, like in any of these games, in terms of, the actual animations. There's a couple animations in other games when you set off the traps for them that they like kind of implode or they die a very, terrible looking death in a lot of these games. Overall, again, it's very simplistic. You're not doing too much. You're setting traps. Some of these versions obviously have more of a focus on setting the traps than others. Again, I think that's where the PC version gets it right, is, hey, you got to do it for 5 minutes. Some of them involve, hey, you got 20 minutes, and that's the entire premise of the game. You got 20 minutes, and you're just supposed to run away. And they will outrun you, right? So you have to literally set traps and slow them down. There's, I think, like a hard mode on one of them where it's like 40 minutes you have to last, which is kind of wild. But, all of these games, there's, again, truly not much there. 5 minutes to set traps, then you just survive. Facing a couple bosses, whether it's crafting and going through, I think, 30 levels on the Sega Genesis version. None of them are all that long. That's kind of common for a game, 1991. You're not going to have a 30-hour adventure here, but some of these games are in the 20 to 40-minute, ranges of play. There's not too much to say, right? Ultimately, I think this is kind of a lesson to, number one, I have no idea how, sequels to all these things got made. Number two, I actually really like to know how these did in the first place. Home Alone is very popular, but I don't know how the games did. And again, kind of like a cautionary tale of, is this why you don't have like a Christmas Vacation game or, any of these you just don't have a lot of, whether it's adaptations of movies or television for Christmas, pour it over to a game, or you just don't have a lot of games that are like definitively Christmas games. There's just very, very few of them. And I think, like I said, the answer's kind of obvious, especially when it comes to Home Alone. There's not enough to work with. You're dealing with like a 10, 15-minute premise, and even if you literally make that last 10 to 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I mean, that's your entire game. So it was fun to go like back down memory lane. And again, I have probably more memories with this game of me not playing it. I think that's actually a statistical fact. I have more memories of me watching the nerd, review these, and I remember the Macaulay Culkin episode of it. And so when I thought, okay, I want to go back, I want to play one of these literal adaptation Christmas games, I remembered the nerd, watched those again, tried to find whatever version I could online. I think you can actually find most of the versions. I chose the PC, and, again, it is like, one thing I will say to end this that I do respect, I do like the era of different version literally means different version, right? So if you're playing on Game Boy versus SNES versus, Genesis, whatever, they're all going to be slightly different. You got like 6 or 7 versions of this game. And most of them aren't good. Some of them are a little bit better than others, but like I said, besides like Chamber of Secrets, we haven't really focused on a lot of games that do it. And I'll be honest, like, I like the era. I like talking about games, but I don't think I'd ever want that to like return. I definitely don't want, hey, PS5 is going to do one thing, but PC is going to be a slightly different version. It's like you're almost playing different games. So that is what the Game Boy kind of had to do back in the day, right? Oftentimes, if you went to the Game Boy Advance or whatever color, if you went to the Game Boy versus something else, you were going to get a pretty drastically different experience just because that thing was around for a very, very long time and obviously not too powerful, so you had to change up the actual game. So I like the era. I like that there are different versions. I never want to see that return, but it's cool to return, I guess, this is before I was even born, so that's pretty neat to kind of go back to. So let me know what you think about the Home Alone games, about the Home Alone movies if you want in the comments. Make sure as always you're subscribed to the channel, bell icon turned on. I hope to see you all on the next one.